fellow developers, writers, and everyone who loves game design.
Welcome to DLC Not Included, our weekly podcast where we discuss game development, the industry, and everything in between.
We're your hosts, Steele
and Teal. Glad you could join us.
So this is the first podcast of 2022 and episode 15 of season 2 of DLC Not Included.
Yes, and we are very excited to be bringing you a whole new slew of topics for this new year.
And the topic that we're going to start with today is going to be, well, as Teal and I were talking, one that helps really separate the developers who want to punch their game up as opposed to the developers who are okay with just presenting their game.
This really defines, is this a good game or great game?
Yes, because the emotion of your game is ultimately one of your highest goals.
Yeah.
Along with enjoyability, playability, and retention, if your player doesn't feel your game, then you as a game developer are lacking in something. So what is it that we're going to talk about that's really going to help punch that emotion in your game's presentation?
We're going to talk about cinematography, principles, and techniques.
So cinematography actually comes from cinema, the film, and has been around for quite some time. In fact, the strict definition that we like to use
from
actually mentions
Merriam-Webster,
which is what, Teal?
The art or science of motion picture photography.
Interesting note, by the way, a little piece of trivia. The first motion picture that was ever shot, I'm using air quotes because that's what we know of, was something called Roundhay Garden Scene, and it was shot in 1888, and it was actually shot to prove a point.
Really?
Yeah,
tell me about that.
Well, horses, when they gallop, they have their four hooves, they're moving. Well, one person said that, yes, at a certain point, all four hooves do leave the ground.
Okay.
And another person says that's ridiculous, they never would. So what they did is they took a photography camera and a whole series of them on the racetrack. So I think it was like a couple of dozen or so, and they shot them in sequence. So that they took a frame of the horse as it ran.
Oh, wow.
And then they went and played it back in sequence, making a motion picture. And it showed that indeed, at a certain point in galloping, all four hooves do leave the ground. So it's interesting. Necessity is the mother of invention. And this whole beautiful thing we have called cinematography started because one person wanted to prove another person wrong.
That's freaking amazing.
We haven't changed that much. However, we're not talking about film today.
No.
We're talking about video games.
We're talking about video games. So what we want to emphasize is that you really want to be using different cinematic techniques in your game.
Yeah.
This is going to aid your narrative storytelling. We're always talking about your narrative.
Right. The definition of cinematography in relation to video games, according to us, is that using cinematic techniques to aid in your game's narrative.
That's right.
By the way, another little piece of trivia. In film, a cinematographer is also called the director of photography, or DOP.
Yes. You see that a lot in the credits.
This will show you how the video game industry is still catching up. Because in video games, there isn't really a standard equivalent. There's no one in the credits always called cinematographer or always called DOP. Not always. Some games do have positions like them. Like, for example, in FF7 Remake, there's a cutscene director.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's important to understand that you, as a game developer, when you're getting involved in cinematography, a lot of times you're going to have to be wearing the hats of both the developer, the director, the level designer, and the person who would set up those shots if this was a movie.
That's true.
So kind of keep that in the back of your head. All right. So I also need to kind of say that cinematography principles and techniques are really becoming important regardless of the genre or engine. So if you're doing a 3D game, a 2D game, a pixel game, it doesn't matter. Actual cinematography, cinema techniques are necessary. They really are.
Because it adds to the player experience. It adds to the immersion. It pulls and draws your player in.
Right.
In a way that just flat shots won't do.
Right, exactly. If you're just presenting your game with a character walks onto a screen and does X, and another character walks onto the screen and does Y, you're not going to have nearly the emotional punch that if you actually apply some of these principles and techniques. So let's go a step further and talk about why should a game developer learn cinematography? Other than just the emotional punch-up we just talked, there's other reasons.
Yeah.
There's other reasons.
Well, one of the reasons is to, every shot, every level has a potential for impact.
Right.
And cinematography is going to help unlock the potential of each of your levels, each of your scenes.
Right. For example, if you've created a level where it's a castle by the sea, and it's right up on a bluff overlooking the drop down to the rocks and then the rocks to the sand, you as the developer, you as the designer, whether you or someone else designed the level is irrelevant, put a lot of thought into this level based off of level maps, drafting, drawings, maps that you've made with the critical path, all the stuff that we've taught in level design. You've put all these little pieces, parts in there to create this gorgeous level. But there are certain parts of that level that are really going to bring out the emotion of whatever you're trying to do. You're going to have one emotion if the princess is looking forlornly over the ocean on top of a turret, as opposed to at the rocky bed right before the cresting waves.
True.
So that potential for your level gets unlocked when you really start studying cinematography, because you start looking at how would each of those areas look in the game.
So it's all about evaluating that potential.
Yeah. What else we got?
It can also assist you, I don't know, in maintaining a consistent visual style.
Yeah. Games have styles. So,
Yeah, we always talk about consistency, and you want to have consistency in your visuals, your audio, that sort of thing.
Right. Think of it like if you're going to film a noir game, a game in the noir style, which is, your very dark contrast between light and dark, hard use of shadows. Well, when you're studying cinematic principles, the principles of cinematography, you're going to look at it from a noir perspective of, those close-ups, it's like, the black room with just a little bit of highlights to the left and the right, showing that it is a room with a door. And you hear the gumshoe. It was 5 o'clock in the evening, and I just closed shop. And then the door opens up, and then light comes in. So that is a style. That is a consistent. So then later on, when the detective is fighting in the alleyway against a thug, you're keeping that same style. The guy is the gumshoe is leaning over a clue.
Yeah.
And then he looks up and looks to the right, and the camera, the viewport, shows that same kind of area where, it's dark in the center, and there's highlights on the side to show this is an alleyway, and then a light shines and it's a car, and like the mob boss or the thug is walking, framed by the light behind them.
Framed by the light, I see.
These are styles, and a cinematographer is going to follow stylistic choices. But it's going to do more than that. It's also learning these techniques is going to teach you to evaluate and reevaluate that lighting.
Which is the most important thing in a game visually is your lighting.
And this is whether it's in an in-game moment or a cutscene. In fact, to be honest with you, if you're listening to us and you're thinking, well, this is only for cutscenes, you're thinking incorrectly. You as a developer need to employ good cinema techniques, even if it's in-game, even if it's the player playing.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
We talk about views and vistas. We talk about wayfinding. All of this gets tied in together with cinematography because now you're presenting it in a way that invokes an emotion.
Yes.
An emotion of your character on a horse going through a forest with just a static camera behind them is going to invoke one emotion. Then you add in the dark lighting and the fog, particle effects and lighting.
Right.
That invokes another emotion. Then you start adding in the audio, like the cicadas or the crickets or the frogs chirping.
Right.
And some distant thunder rumbling in the background. That invokes another emotion. Now you tie it together with a over-the-shoulder shot while the player is controlling the horse, so that they're really uncomfortably close to where the character is going through this haunted forest.
Yeah. Wow.
So it ties it all together.
It ties all together,
It ties it all together. And then the last part is it's going to force you to learn good camera techniques. And those are important.
Absolutely, because where you place your camera is so very important. We've all played in games where it seemed like the camera was swinging wildly and you couldn't focus on what you wanted to focus on.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're going to need to learn these different camera techniques.
Now, unless you're creating a virtual reality game, You can't use the excuse, well, the player can move the camera around any way they want. Because you could have, during that sequence, you can pull in tight and then restrict camera movement to where it only moves a little bit over each shoulder. You, the developer, get to decide how the game's camera works, not the player.
Not the player.
Even an open world game can use this. The only time that you really should not restrict camera movement is in VR. That's an entirely different topic. We would have to do a podcast on VR in general.
Right.
Because the rules change when the player is the camera.
Yes.
So, all right. That is why you should learn cinematography. All these things together are just going to make you a much better developer.
Well, I want to do a deeper dive into the whole art and science of cinematography. And in doing my research, I discovered there are actually 4 principles you have to follow.
Yeah, and the different schools are going to teach you different numbers. Some will say there's 3, some will say there's 5. But when we were doing this research, we found 4 that were consistent.
4, yeah.
That are consistent.
Yeah.
And we're going to use the term camera from now on. And when we say camera, we're talking about the view the player sees within the game, not necessarily what the character sees if it's a third-person game. This is usually defined by some kind of camera tool inside the game engine. I think some 2D games call it a viewport. Just depends.
It depends, but it all references the same thing.
Right.
The point of view of the player.
That's called the camera. So from now on, when we talk about camera, that's what we're talking about. All right, what is the first thing we want to go over, Teal?
The first one is what everybody kind of thinks about when they're doing this, and that's framing.
Yes.
This is what the camera sees, i.e., this is what the player sees.
Right.
Framing.
Right. Framing is extremely important because it's the only thing that the player is going to experience visually.
Yeah.
And this is where, when you first start studying cinema in a film school, when you first start looking at it from a film perspective, I'm going to go there and then kind of come back to video games. You're often forced to learn about theater.
Yeah. Because
theater is all around. You see theater. If you're watching people on a stage, you are watching stage left, stage right. You're watching all the different parts. You're watching all the actors move around on the stage. In cinematography, you're then told, now put your fingers together and make a small window.
Yeah.
That's what the camera sees. So you have to learn to think within the frame. Best lesson I ever learned in film school was when the cinematography professor said, it doesn't matter what happens off screen because the viewer will never see it.
Yeah.
All that matters is what's in frame. And that's the same thing in a video game. Doesn't matter what's happening off screen. You can actually prepare crazy shit like, TIE fighters coming in, headless horsemen riding by.
Yeah.
You can have them right off frame, sitting there, picking their nose or their idle animation running. You can do whatever you want. Just make sure that once it's in frame, it's exactly what you want the player to see.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you kind of need to think in that. You need to shift your brain from this is the entire sequence to what do I want the player to see. Now, again, in an open world game, that may be a little different. You may have to go, okay, I need to change the constraints of the frame just a little bit because the player can now look 20 degrees to the left or the right or up or down. But it's still a frame.
It's still a frame, and you still have to keep everything in it.
Yes.
So in your example, you were talking about the headless horseman just sitting there idling on the side. That's really important to think about because that's at the beyond the edge of the frame.
Right, just beyond. Right.
And I'm thinking that at the edges of the frame, you really don't want to have a lot of focus there. You want to keep the focus more towards the center of the frame.
Right. You don't want to linger, specifically what Teal is talking about. You don't want to linger movement and subjects at the edge of the frame for a long period of time because it causes anxiety within the viewer or player, unless you're specifically trying to do it. Here's the reason why. We, as human beings, only have a certain field of view. We can only see so much around us.
Yeah.
And when something is just outside of our field of view, that instinct, that primal instinct of is that danger kicks in. So, if it's there for a couple of seconds, it's like, what was that? If it's there for a long period of time, it starts to get that little queasy feeling of is that dangerous or not? And you want to turn your head to look at it.
Yes.
Well, if a player can't move the camera because it's that certain kind of cut scene and you have something just at the edge of the frame, it's going to distract them because that natural desire to look and see what is that thing.
Yes.
Now you can use this against your player in a horror game where you briefly.
I was thinking of horror games specifically. This would be a good tool,
right.
But sparingly. Use it sparingly, because you don't want to cause unnatural anxiety within your player.
Or even worse, desensitize them to where it never works again.
Yeah.
It's like the whole concept of a jump scare. A jump scare is cheap if it's used multiple times, and really cheap if it's overused.
Yeah.
And kind of cheap if it's used once or twice. You build up an entire game to a jump scare. Okay, good. You did your job.
Yeah.
Use a jump scare in the first 5 minutes of the game. Okay, don't do it again. Do something else.
Yeah, please.
Every 5 minutes you do a jump scare, and then you get made fun of on stream because your game is cheap at that point.
Right.
So the whole idea is the same thing. Don't reuse this. But going back to cinematography, going back to actual good cinematic techniques, if you're creating a ballroom scene and you have your focus being this couple dancing, don't linger too much in this frame, in this one shot of other couples around. It's okay to move your camera.
Yes.
So that you're having the other couples dancing coming in and out of frame. That's fine. But if you had a lingering long shot and you had people just out of frame or just at the edge of the frame for a long period of time, it can get distracting. You would have to use some kind of a depth of field technique or something. And unless that's a stylistic choice, you're creating more work for yourself.
Yes. Yeah, you are.
Speaking of movement.
Oh.
Keep your movement within your frame.
Yeah.
Very important. The best example of this, and this is from a movie, not a video game, watch the opening sequence to Raiders of the Lost Ark. When Indy is there with the gold statue. And he does the whole replaces the gold statue with the bag of sand. That whole sequence of him there with the bag of sand, testing the weight of it and all of that and getting ready to do the switch. That is such a good concept of keeping things moving. It's not constant movement. There's not constantly things moving all over the place, but it doesn't get stale. It's just the right bit of building tension. Okay, is this enough sand? Okay, let me let some sand out because the idol statue and the bag of sand have to be almost the exact same weight. And he's kind of sweating, and Harrison Ford has the, kind of that look of anticipation of this is the moment where I'm either going to get this artifact or get killed, one or the other, right?
Yeah.
It's just beautifully done. So you want to keep that movement, some movement. It could be trees moving. It could be a person in the background sipping some Chardonnay and talking to the Duke. Some level of motion. This is the same in a 2D pixel-based game.
Yeah.
Something has to be moving. A lot of times in cutscenes, especially in games that we watch through, new developers, during a cutscene, people will just be standing around. There won't be any movement. And it gets really stale really fast.
Yeah.
While if you watch a cutscene that maybe takes place in a lab, different developer, and you got the computers beeping in the background and changing icons, okay, maybe that's distracting. But now you have this same sequence where the little lights on the computers are blinking, some scientists are moving to the side, the camera's focused in on the table around the holographic map.
Yeah.
That's just, just a little bit of movement. And then, when the head scientist makes a statement, he moves, from the north side of the table to the northeast, down to the east, and brings up something. That's life. Life has movement. So it doesn't matter what your engine is, have that movement. Have something in frame.
Yeah.
So framing itself is just one of the techniques, but it's one that if you overlook, you're going to start losing your players pretty quickly because they're either going to be like, what's going on?
What's going on?
Or nothing's going on.
Yeah. Either or.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another point, and that's your angle of your camera. Camera angles, shots.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the camera angles and shots are pretty much the angle of the camera, which we've already defined what that is, and how it frames the subject. Okay, so let's define subject, because this may not be what you think it is. The subject isn't necessarily the main character or main focal point of the scene in its entirety. The subject of whatever you're doing is whatever at the moment you want the player to focus on. So there's for example, let's get, here we go. Let's get the first part of Kingdom Hearts, the Dive to Heart. That was a good example of subjects constantly changing. When Sora first enters, it's just him standing on the stained glass of Snow White. Then when he moves forward, suddenly the subject is the 3 pedestals. So each one of those pedestals pop out with the sword, the shield, and the wand. So the subject has changed. Another good example of subjects changing would be, well, let's go to a movie.
Okay.
Let's think cinematically. Star Wars: A New Hope. The scene in Mos Eisley where Han Solo is confronted by Greedo.
Yeah.
So in the sequence, he sits down, and while he's sitting, Harrison Ford's the subject when he's in frame. So all of the cinema techniques that we talked about have to deal with Han Solo.
Right.
When we swap over to Guido speaking, he's the subject. So it's whatever you want the player to focus on at that moment.
Yeah.
It could be a bag of gold coins.
Or an apple.
Yeah. Whatever it is, that's your subject.
Yeah.
So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about camera angles and shots. What can we do?
Well, first of all, we've talked about this in the past, and that's establishing the shot.
Yes. We got to learn the different types of cinematic shots and angles. There are dozens of them. You can Google cinematic shots, cinematic angles, and you're going to get a laundry list. And the one that Teal brought up is the establishing shot.
Mm-hmm.
The establishing shot is what is first seen when the sequence or scene starts. Great example. You have a tavern where the story's going to start because that's what D&D does.
Yeah.
And the camera pans in from one place to the tavern. That's an establishing shot.
Yeah.
The player now knows, without you telling them, that this scene that they're about to switch over to is inside of
this tavern.
Yeah. Another good, the 2 other ones that people think of when they think of shots are close and long. There's many variations. We're not going to go over all the different types of shots and angles. It's just not. That's not a good thing to have. It would take all day.
That would take all day. Yeah.
But think of it this way. Think of it like this: a long shot that shows the entire subject from head to toe is going to create more of a disconnect and more of a sense of observation.
Yeah.
Than a close-up shot, like in The Good and the Bad, the Ugly, where it just showed an extreme close of just the eyes of the 3 people right before the guns were drawn.
Mm-hmm.
During the climax of the movie. 2 different sets of emotions. You, the cinematographer, have to learn what each of these shots are. And you have to use them appropriately to invoke the right emotion. So, since we're not going to teach you every shot, Google it and read up on what they do. There's a wealth of information there. And you want to use these different angles and shots to invoke a particular emotion. Let me talk a little bit about these, and you can throw out your examples as well.
Sure.
The POV shot. How strong is that POV shot in Kill Bill when it shows Beatrix looking up at the 4 people who just beat the shit out of her right before Bill shoots her?
Yeah, wow.
That's
it's a very powerful emotional moment.
Just like
because you are Beatrix.
Yes. And at the very beginning of the movie, when Beatrix is on the ground, bloodied.
Yeah.
After she just got beat up, and you're looking through sort of Bill's POV before he shoots her, a different emotion.
Yeah.
It's really good to use POV shots. Then you could have things like the high angle. So that's the camera up, looking
way
down.
up, looking down.
Makes the subject look shorter.
Yeah.
Can make the subject look submissive.
That's true.
Well, it's like if you're the king sitting on the throne and you have a high angle shot looking down at the poor peasant that you're about to pass judgment on, that's a feeling of dominance.
Mm-hmm.
Other way around, if you switch to the peasant's point of view and do a low angle, looking up.
Right, you have low angle shots where you are down below and you're looking up
at the king.
At the
Suddenly,
king.
Boom, there's the dominance.
Yeah.
So you can use that. One more thing before we move on, the Dutch angle.
Explain a little bit about that Dutch angle.
Oh, okay. The Dutch angle is overused, but it can never be used too much. The Dutch angle is when you take the camera and just tilt it a little bit. Just tilt it a little bit so that the horizontal is no longer horizontal. And I mean, you don't have to go all the way to like 45, 50 degrees.
I wouldn't do that.
But it's a tilt. It's a good, solid tilt that creates unease.
Yeah.
It's used so much in horror because it gives you that sense of equilibrium is off.
Yeah.
So the Dutch angle is really good for any kind of accent, but is especially useful in horror.
Right. That feeling of unease.
Yes, that unease.
Something is off.
Something is amiss.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So anything else in relation to cameras that we should go over?
We need to go over lighting.
Oh, yes.
Guys, lighting
Remember
so
lighting.
important in your shots.
Never forget lighting. We did a podcast on it in the past. Key lighting, which is the light that's on directly on your subject. Side lighting, which is filler backlighting. You need to learn all that.
You've got to get good with your lighting.
Yeah, you've got to remember that, no matter what. All right. So that's going to be for angles and shots, right?
Right. I want to talk about the camera movement.
Oh, yes. Camera
because
movement.
we've all played games where the camera moved badly, and it sure was a janky experience that took you right out of it. Took you right out of the zone.
Yes, yes. So you want to define how the camera moves in scenes or sequences.
Yeah.
Here's the difference between the two. This is coming from a film background, but you can apply it to video games. A sequence is a series of quick actions that define a single longer action. Like, for example, a sequence would be the hero drawing out his sword, getting into the ready stance with lightning in the background, and then attacking.
Yeah.
That's a sequence.
That's a sequence.
A scene is a bunch of sequences brought together to form a narrative. So just keep that in mind if you ever read anything about scenes and sequences. People who do a film all the time, they'll throw those around. We don't want you to get confused. But you're going to want to learn stuff.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different techniques under camera movement.
Yes.
We've got tracking,
right?
For example.
Tracking is when the camera follows the subject. So a third-person game, the camera automatically tracks. But if you want to use it cinematically, let's say that the hunter is going through the forest and he's going to hunt the deer, and then the deer runs, and suddenly the camera starts chasing the deer as the deer runs off into the forest to show where the player has to go. That's tracking.
That's tracking.
That's tracking.
And there's another thing, dollying.
Dollying's a little different. In cinema, dollying is literally on a track, camera on a track, and it moves either forward or backward away from the subject or alongside the subject.
Yeah.
If you have your desperados on their horses trying to catch the train and your camera is moving alongside of them, that's dollying.
Yeah.
But you can easily do that in a game engine.
That's a lot of fun to actually program.
Yes, dollying can be good. Dollying can be good.
Here's another thing to learn, panning.
Panning is, well, we described that earlier with the tavern establishing shot. When you move sideways. So moving forward is dollying. If you move purely sideways, not focusing on the subject, but showing the scene.
Just showing the scene.
That's panning.
Panning.
A really good example of a panning shot that's not establishing could be during a very tense situation. Okay. Where you have, the card players, the card sharp is getting ready to get his royal flush in.
Right.
And the camera just keeps panning on each one of the subjects as they're looking at the other shifty-eyed. And someone's moving their cards to fan them out a little bit so they can see what they have.
Yeah.
I think they did that in Maverick. That's panning. Panning can be used pretty much anytime you want to go, here's something cool.
Yeah.
There's something cool. And each time I said here and there, imagine the camera moving over something cool.
Yeah. Another technique is tilting.
Yes, tilting indeed. Tilting is, the Dutch shot is part of tilting. So it's, when you when you roll the camera to the side, left or right, a little bit so that you create that horizontal becomes a diagonal.
Right.
And that can be used to create feelings of unease, to create feelings of surprise. Think of it like the head going, tilting to the side and going, what?
Yeah.
You can use it for that.
Yeah.
So, tilting takes you a little bit off your equilibrium, can create dis-ease, a sense of dis-ease, can create a sense of surprise, maybe even, wonderment, just how you use it.
Yeah.
And there's other types of camera movements.
There's so many different
again,
ones.
You want to Google this and you want to read about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So while you're doing all this, focus on the subject.
Right.
Keep the camera's focus on your subject.
And the subject can and will change.
Absolutely, it will change. And it should change so you can keep that movement going.
I'm going to go over two examples that, we were talking about, Teal and I were talking about, and then we'll kind of accent upon these if we can.
Sure.
Example one, the subject is actually a magic ball, a crystal orb. So the main character grabs the crystal orb off the pedestal, and then the camera's following the hero, the main character with the crystal orb.
The crystal orb.
Then they hand the crystal orb off to an officer. I feel like I'm doing the beginning of FF4 here. And the officer walks with the crystal orb, but the camera continues tracking that officer.
The officer with the orb.
And then the officer hands it to a mage who puts it in a special container. And then the mage walks off towards the airship, and the camera's following the mage. The camera's not the subject of this is not the main character, the officer, or the mage. It's the orb.
Yes.
So in that instance, you're following that same object throughout the entire scene.
You're following it, you're tracking it, and then let's take it a step further. The mage gets on the airship, and the airship starts to lift, and it goes. And then all of a sudden you have a panning shot, and it shows just the area the airship is in as it goes away, and you see, I'm actually in a desert.
Yeah, right. And so what you've done at this point is you've shifted your subject to the airship. So the subject has changed. It's now the airship, and it brings you to a vista. And then the camera goes back down, back to the main character, and the main character is sitting there talking with their best companion.
Right.
Then at this point, you just change the subject from crystal to airship back to main character. That's a sequence. That's a scene.
Congratulations, you just built a scene.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And while you're doing all this, please remember to keep your framing.
Keep your framing.
Yeah, keep your framing.
I can't emphasize that enough. The player can't see what's off your frame.
Yeah.
If it's not there, if it's not in your frame, it can't be seen.
Yeah. So just remember all of this. While you're doing all of this malarkey, keep your framing. Very important. Now we're going to go on to the last piece, the last principle that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, that's timing.
That's the pacing of your sequence and your scenes. Now, we want to give a disclaimer, and this is not to discourage. This is just so you understand. We cannot teach you timing and pacing.
Actually, no one can teach you this.
Yeah, no one can. But we can give you the tools so that you can learn. You, the cinematographer, you, the game developer, just as if you were a film editor, you're going to learn this through doing it over and over and over again.
Absolutely.
There is a bit of a gift here. Pacing is often called the sixth sense. Sixth sense? Sixth sense of the editor/director. It's often called that. This doesn't mean that if you don't have that sixth sense, you're going to fail. It just means that it's going to be a little harder. You're going to have to learn those techniques. You're going to have to become intuitive.
Yep.
In order to get timing and pacing down. So don't be discouraged. This could take a long time, or you could get it within the first few games. First few shots.
Right, the first few shots. So one of the things that you can work on to get better at timing is work on your patterns.
Establishing patterns, yes. Yes.
Establish your patterns of your cuts and your fades. Things that the player is going to recognize.
Right. We've talked about, I believe it's affordance before, where when they see a crate or a barrel in Skyrim, they think food. They see a treasure chest, they think money. Exactly. So this is similar. This is kind of an affordance in a cinematic way.
Yeah.
So for example, actually any 3D Zelda game really. Let's talk about Ocarina of Time because that's my favorite. Whenever young Link gets to a treasure chest, he opens it up, jumps in with his little feet wiggling, and then pulls out whatever he's pulling out.
Right.
That is a pattern. So now the player will know this particular sequence means I just found something good.
Yeah.
So they'll start to equate different types of cuts, different types of fades. Red Dead Redemption, when you're about to do a gun duel, you have right before the duel starts, they have, the camera, cuts to you, cuts to your opponent, cuts to you, cuts to their opponent, faster and faster and faster and faster. And then right behind you and pulls back slowly with the heartbeat as you have to get that meter up to do the quick draw. Yeah. That's a pattern. The player will equate this sequence of shots and cuts to I am one-on-one with my opponent.
Yes, exactly.
So learning to establish your patterns as a developer during these sequences will help you with your pacing and help you consistently give the emotion you want to your player. Let's go the other route.
The route of symmetry.
Okay, so this is not symmetry as in what's in the left is the right. This is more like the rising action and the falling action match each other over the course of the narrative.
Yes.
Please explain that in a way that's not steel talk.
Okay, so symmetry is when you're going to be using the same type of shot or angle to punch up similar moments.
When we were getting ready for the podcast, we actually came up with a hypothetical that we feel...
which was a really good one.
This encapsulates it. So you're playing a bounty hunter, and at the start of the game, you go kill a bandit chief, okay? And you have to use the head of the enemy to, collect your bounty. So you got to bring the head of the bounty chief. So the game's first sequence is you killing the bounty chief, killing the bandit chief. You go into town to collect the bounty. and you're at the bounty office at the police, the sheriff's office.
The sheriff's office, yeah.
And you have a sequence of there's the table, the sheriff's table, and then boom, the bandit chief head hits it, kind of makes some coins flash or whatever. And then the camera pans up to the bounty hunter and it's like, I've come to collect my bounty. Okay, you've done that.
Yes.
So it's a very powerful thing of decapitated head, hard enough to make the coin shake, camera pan up, I'm here to collect my bounty.
Okay. So now let's move forward. So in the course of the game, you find out that the real bad guys are the magistrate and maybe the mayor.
Yeah,
okay?
whatever. Yeah,
they're working together.
Yes, corrupt politicians.
They're corrupt politicians. They were using the bandits to take down the town, and you discover this.
Yes.
So after your final fight, they're the bosses. You defeat them.
Yeah.
You cut off their heads.
Cut off their heads.
Then you walk over to the bounty office.
Yes.
You go up to the table.
Yes, the same shot. So
the same shot.
And
then take the heads. Boom.
So you now have the table. The two heads of the two bad guys who were the politicians in the office hit the table, the coin splatter, and then the camera goes up to the bounty hunter. This one's for free. That's just a punch of emotion.
Yes, it is.
That's symmetry.
Exactly.
You use something early to invoke an emotion, and then you punch it up to the next level by doing the same thing later.
Mm-hmm.
Same types of shots. Same.
Yes.
It's just same.
The same.
Chef's kiss. Chef's kiss. The last one that we're going to talk about in relation to pacing and timing is a little on the abstract side. So we may spend a bit kind of talking about theories and examples here, but that's flow.
Yes.
Flow's so important.
You want to keep the pacing of your scene in line with the pacing of your story.
So let me tell you what flow is not.
Okay.
Flow is not constantly things happening.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you know how we talked about keeping movement? Remember, movement doesn't have to be the player moving. Movement doesn't have to be, the animals moving in the background. Movement is some kind of motion to show the world is alive.
Yeah.
Refer back to our animation principles we did last time.
Mm-hmm.
Life in the world is movement. However, it doesn't always have to be the main character moving at a frantic pace, moving very quickly. It doesn't always have to be the main character slogging. It doesn't always have to be the same pace constantly.
Yeah. You want to vary it up.
Your story is going to have a flow.
Yeah.
There are times when your story is going to move very quickly. There's going to be times when your story slows down. Mm-hmm. There's going to be time when it goes back and forth between the two. You want the pacing of your scene to keep in line with that. And the example that Teal and I came up with, it's a movie, not a game, that we feel encapsulates this. And if you can mimic this in your games, you got a good start. The beginning sequences of Into the Spider-Verse.
Yes.
When Miles Morales wakes up and there's this frantic rush to get dressed, get fed, and get to school.
Yeah.
It's really frantic. And then he's in the car with his dad and everything slows down. And it's a nice slow pace as he has a casual conversation with his father where we're establishing Miles Morales's, moving to a new school. His what is it that this teenage boy is going to be going through now? These things that a guy Miles' age feels.
So visually, while that's happening in the car, the only movement inside the car is the two characters talking. Right. Outside the car, it's just this generic,
it's
almost
New York
misty background. It's it's kind of a vague background. It's the same kind of stuff.
It's the motion of New York.
Yeah,
but it's motion of New York in a way that unless the camera's focusing on it, it's just New York. It's another day.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the camera shows outside while Miles is looking outside, you see this world that Miles is trying to find his place in. Then the camera goes back to them inside, and like Teal said, it's not misty vague like a mist, but it's like just generic action.
It's just generic
stuff. Yeah. Then Miles gets out of the car, and suddenly he's in this new place, and the angles and the frames are ones of you're looking up at the school, Discovery, a large shot that shows all the students, especially when they look at him when his dad embarrasses him.
Yeah.
So it's fast, slow, a little bit faster, a lot slower, and then boom, he's outside. And there's that feeling of, I just got humiliated by my father.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good flow. So you want your games to have that flow. Here's what you want to avoid. You do not want to mimic the opening to Skyrim. It is iconic. It is beyond iconic.
Oh, yeah.
But it is, and we've talked about it, a very bad opening.
Yeah.
Because it is a very slow pace. The pauses between Rayloff and the horse thief talking is a little too long. Those pauses are a little too pregnant.
Yeah.
And it's more really, honestly, the opening to Skyrim, forgive me for saying this, those who are fans of Skyrim, because I am too, it is Bethesda showing off their new game engine.
Yeah.
Their new creation engine and how pretty the game is.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
That's all it is.
But it flows very slowly. Now, having said that, once you get into Helgen, the flow does pick up.
Yes.
It actually is good when you see General Tullius talking to Elwyn, and then it goes around and you see a little kid, Danning or whatever his name is, talking to his father, and the father says, get inside. That's actually pretty good pacing. That's good flow at that point. But you want to avoid that long carriage ride, because unless you're putting in things that the player can see that are moving things forward, you're just showing off your vista.
Yeah.
So again, we could go over flow, the good, the bad, all day. This is like the rest of timing and pacing. We can't teach you. We can just give you examples of what works and what doesn't work, and then you have to figure it out. But
the key here is you've got to practice.
Practice. Yeah. Practice.
When you're testing your game in front of a live audience, if you will,
or a streamer, whatever.
A streamer.
Yeah.
Watch for your player reactions. Okay. Yeah. Especially to certain key scenes that you feel are key. Watch the reaction. Most
new developers, especially ones who are in a streamer-centric community, like, for example, the RPG Maker community, they always look at whether or not the streamer, Let's Player, whoever, runs into a problem.
Yeah.
But what they don't usually look for, and what I think all new developers need to start looking for, is how do they react to the scenes that you create that you want a particular impact? Like, for example, if you want a romantic interlude to create a feeling of dis-ease because you know one of them is actually a bad guy, do they get that? Or do they feel, okay, this dude's screwed? If there's a series of tension between an antagonist and protagonist, do you want that feeling of, when the player walks away, oh God, am I the good guy? Am I the bad guy? Or are they just like, okay, I'm going to kick Mark's ass later?
Yeah.
You need to watch those reactions, because if they're not feeling what you want them to feel, then it's either writing, cinematography, or both.
Yeah.
Somehow in this presentation, you haven't punched it up. And usually, especially if your writing is good, it is a cinematography.
Yeah.
You haven't timed it properly. You haven't given the pauses that need to be there, and you haven't removed the pauses that don't need to be there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And so when you're looking at movies or playing video games, have a critical eye. Pay attention to the cinematography, how the camera is moving, what it's focusing on during the scenes, and during gameplay.
Yes.
Pay attention to that. Develop your critical eye.
Yes. It does help to watch a lot of movies. A cinematographer came from film. That's where the whole thing came from. So if you watch a lot of really well-cut movies, then you're going to get a lot of better of an eye of that.
Yeah.
For camera angles and close-ups and shots, watch Quentin Tarantino.
Sure. Yes.
Specifically, Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill, Reservoir Dogs. They're just masterfully shot, and that'll give you an idea how to use cuts and angles appropriately. If you want good pacing and timing, really good horror movies. Cape Fear is very well shot, very well edited. I don't remember too much about the movie. Sixth Sense has some good pacing as well. So those are some good ones. But, and then Google, movies with good pacing.
Yeah.
Movies with good angles, movies with good cuts, and watch them.
Watch them and start developing your critical eye. Yeah.
Start developing your critical eye, and then start playing games that emulate that. All right. It is a lifelong journey. No disrespect to anyone who's like, oh my goodness, this is too much. Yes, it is a lot. It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, it is. So just keep practicing and keep doing it.
Yep. Okay, so now it's time for us to take questions from our live audience.
If you've been watching, remember to use the podcast question feature in our chat.
Yeah, please remember, because we actually don't monitor live chat during this. No. All we do is monitor the podcast questions that come up on our big screen.
Right.
And we do have a question.
Okay. I don't see it.
You don't see it?
Nope.
Okay. You don't see a question.
I do not see a question.
All right, let me bring it over there. There you go. Okay. You see it now?
Yes.
Okay. What's the question?
Do you have a favorite game or games that would be good to use to study the techniques you've talked about in this episode? This question's from KB.
I do. I actually do. And in researching this podcast, I came across references to this game and actually watched a lot of the cinematics from this game. This game is not necessarily very well good on the gameplay side, but I think it's the order.
Okay.
The order.
Yeah, the order.
I think it's like 1866 or something like that. I was watching some of the sequences from the game, and the game is masterfully shot.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. The Last of Us. Its cinematic sequences are really good. Mm-hmm. Heavy Rain.
Heavy Rain has really good cinematography.
In fact, anything by David Cage, but specifically Heavy Rain and Detroit Become Human.
Yeah.
Very
good cinematography.
Yeah, can't get around those. Can't get wrong with those. Any on your end, Brett?
No, I was thinking Heavy Rain.
Yeah,
that was my big one.
If you want to go full Hollywood style, 100%, go with Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Yeah.
Its cutscenes are absolutely incredible. The scene in the bar where Tifa's making Cloud a drink establishes more rapport between the characters and shows more of their inner workings than most of the game. Tifa wants to impress Cloud. This is her childhood friend who she has feelings for.
Yeah.
And Cloud is stoic and doesn't want to show Tifa any emotion, but it's Tifa. He does care about her.
Sure.
You know, not necessarily romantically, but he definitely cares about her.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like they're flirting while she's making him a drink, and it's a fantastically shot sequence.
Very, very well shot.
You know, and most of the game is shot beautifully cinematically. Mm-hmm. So good question, KV. Very good question. Let's see if we don't have any others. We'll go ahead and start rounding this up while we're waiting. So Teal, back when we first started dating, you yourself got to see some of the cinematic stuff that we worked on, you know, when I was going through film school.
That's true.
Did you feel that you became more critical, you know, watching movies with a critical eye when I started going to film school?
Yes, actually I did. I paid a lot of attention to camera movement and to lighting. Mm-hmm. I discovered that those were really defining things in any kind of scene or shot. I saw examples of really poor lighting when we were viewing some of the student films, and it made a difference. It really did. I learned a lot about the way that you shoot things. I mean, there were times when you would just I remember the bucket Foley.
Oh God!
I mean, excuse me, the bucket dolly.
The bucket dolly.
The bucket dolly. So we had a guy get into a janitor's bucket, a mop bucket, and we pushed him along, and he had the camera, and
because we didn't have the ability to put out a dolly track, but we had to have smooth movement during a specific
sequence. So that's what we did, and it worked, and it looked good on film.
Right. It looked ridiculous off film. Now, the cool thing that you guys can think about, though, is when you're working in a game engine, you got a plethora of tools that aren't buckets.
Yeah.
That aren't janitor buckets. So it's also important for you to learn your game engine's tools.
Yeah.
It really is. If you don't learn your game engine's tools, then you're kind of setting yourself up.
That's for anything.
Yeah.
Not just for cinematography.
Right.
Just learn those tools.
Right.
Know your engine.
Okay, we do have another podcast question.
Okay, this is also from KB. Do you have a favorite game, either RPG Maker or one that uses a similar 2D perspective that makes good use of cinematic techniques?
There's a horror game called The Last Survivor.
Yeah.
It's one where, creepily enough, you don't actually have to kill the enemies to win. It is a very neat game, and I really like the way that they use the lighting, the camera motions, the camera movement, the character motions, and such. It is itself a very good game, but the way that it uses different cinematic techniques, including a visual style that matches the entire game, I really like it.
Yeah.
What about you? Anyone in particular catches you? No? Okay. So I think at that point, the Last Survivor, because it's horror is a really good example.
Yes, it is.
Of honestly, if cinema and lighting aren't good in a horror game, the horror game gets blown up. So I feel that in general, horror forces good cinematic techniques.
So that's a really easy one to develop your critical eye.
Yeah. Looking
at horror games.
Yeah.
Playing
absolutely.
through them.
A very good question, KV, because it's not just about 3D.
No, 2D. Yeah. It's still very important.
What we always say whenever there's something related to lighting, design, anything graphical, 2D developers do not get a pass on anything.
Absolutely not.
In many ways, it's kind of harder because they're working on a constrained 2D plane. So, remember your layering, all that stuff, your views and your vistas. If you're creating your 2D game, remember to create that mock 3D. Honestly, another good one that's really old is Symphony of the Night.
Oh,
it has a fantastic cinematic presentation. It opens with a beautiful in media res, just beautiful, right in the thick of the action with the last battle between Richter and Dracula. So it's a bit older than Last Survivor. Last Survivor's within the last decade. Symphony of the Night's longer.
Yeah.
But I would definitely say those two are a really good example of how to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So as we're getting ready to wrap this up, we cannot stress how important this is. And it brings together a lot of the stuff that we've talked about over season 2, bringing it all back to the first episode of season 2, which is the user experience.
Yes.
Because ultimately, your players have to enjoy the experience of your game. And if they don't, if your lighting is off, your writing is off, your cinematography is off, your audio, they're going to feel it. So again, that solo dev has to wear all the hats.
All of them. And you have to develop your critical eye and just practice.
Yeah.
Practice. Make games.
Practice.
Join game jams. Do things to push yourself to get better.
If you feel that you need to work on one particular skill set, like cinema, join a game jam as part of a team and say, I want to focus on that. I've joined movie festivals here in Houston.
That's right.
Where I've said, hey, I specifically want to help with writing. I specifically want to help as DOP or assistant DOP or whatever. Hell, I ended up being an actor in a film that won an award because they needed an actor. And I'm like, I haven't acted in years. Let me try.
Yeah. You got out there and tried.
I got out there and tried. And I mean, at some points I was like, oh God, I'm terrible. But, we ended up getting a place.
Yeah, you did.
So, you gotta put yourself out there. You gotta try something that you've never tried before that you could totally fail in. And don't be afraid to fail.
The only way you're going to learn is through your failures.
Yeah. Yeah. Success is a good teacher. Failure is a
better.
Incredible, amazing.
Yeah.
Oompa Loompa awesome. All right, we want to thank each and every one of you, whether you were listening on our live audience, or whether you were listening VOD on YouTube, or if you're listening to us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Amazon Music, etc., etc. We love doing this for you guys, and we're going to keep doing it for as long as we can.
So keep tuning in every Saturday.
Right, so join us next time for DLC Not Included, and remember,
anyone can give you the key, but you have to go through the door.